Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. I am Dave Levine, with my co-host Denise Howell on the Hearsay Culture Network with a new episode of R&D with D&D, our show on the Hearsay Culture Network, where we dive deeply into a variety of topics that hopefully give you actionable takeaways and that give you insights at a level that you don't normally hear on radio or in podcasting. I'm very excited, and we are very excited to have on the show today a prolific scholar in the space of technology and also identity, Professor Mar Hicks of the University of Virginia School of Data Science. Mar's work is well known in a variety of areas with people who focus on how technology is used and how biases can creep into technology, both intentionally and unintentionally, and the consequences. And Mar is a prolific author, having most recently co-authored a book with Ben Peters, a former guest on the KZSU's Hearsay Culture, of the book Your Computer is on Fire, which she co-edited with Ben along with Kavita Phillip and Tom Mulaney, where they looked at, as the title suggests, the various concerns from a few years ago that arose as the internet was emerging really from its first incarnation and starting to move in some new directions. Now, that book came out prior to generative artificial intelligence and ChatGPT. And so arguably our computers are even more on fire today than they were a few years ago. And we're going to dig into some of that stuff there. But the book was quite trenchant in a variety of areas and one that was fun chatting about. We are going to discuss today several topics related to Mar's work, as well as, again, identity, civil rights, and other areas in technology on R&D with D&D. We're recording today on May 23rd, 2024. Mar is joining us via Zoom. Mar, welcome to R&D with D&D.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, Mar, as I mentioned, there's so many topics that we could talk about here, but I want to jump right in and talk about first an issue that is maybe not too surprising in light of the fact that technology is driven towards trying to bring people in and draw attention. Cosmopolitan magazine published an article a couple of years ago now in October 2022 entitled AI Voice Assistants Are Often Women, and Here's Why It's a Problem. And what they talk about in this article, and just to open it up, is that while AI voice assistants are women often, the dynamics around that are kind of surprising. And before I ask you a couple of questions about it, I'm curious to get your visceral reaction to that. What's your take on the fact that we do see Siri is an obvious example, but there are others, right, of these AI assistants going back prior to ChatGPT being voiced or at least sounding like women?
Yeah, I mean, for a long time, the Air Force has had emergency voices, oftentimes that are women, and colloquially, she's known as Bitchin' Betty, right? Because she's bitching at them when something's going wrong with the plane. And that's kind of funny, right? But it's also a little bit of a problematic dynamic when we're talking to these voice assistants every day in our homes, and it's always a woman's voice, maybe, that we're yelling at, or that we're frustrated with, or that, for instance, younger generations see adults treating in a rude fashion. I'm not suggesting that people don't know the difference between machines and real people, or even that children don't know the difference between machines and real people. But a lot of things happen that shape the way that we interact with the world around us that we're not fully cognizant of. And I have to say, these AI voice assistants, as you well know, they have women's voices for a reason. And that the reason that they have women voicing them, it's historical. It has a lot to do with labor and subservience and the roles that we expect women to be in, even if we don't consciously believe that's where women should be. A lot of people maybe have unconscious beliefs. So yeah, it's not the biggest problem in the world, but it's not great.
One of the things that the article points out as part of the challenge is that the perception is that female voices are, quote, nicer, which reinforces these older stereotypes. And yet, right, that's quite common. And then from the perspective of companies creating this technology, they might say, and if that's how people feel, shouldn't we have a nice voice?
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that really kind of gets to me as somebody who is a historian of technology, but also really a labor historian, I'm concerned with, what machines do and what people do with them work-wise. And so that's why I focus on women and women's labor a lot, because the early history of computing actually was feminized. Um, what does it mean when we take somebody's voice, essentially? Because up until very recently, none of these voices were AI generated. They were all trained by voice actors. So you essentially take somebody's voice and you disembody it, and you make it so that person got paid a very, very small amount for a subset of the labor used to train that device to sound like her. And then forever after, she hears her voice in any number of different applications, saying any number of things that maybe she doesn't even feel comfortable with her voice voicing, which is actually exactly what happened with one of the original TikTok voices, a woman voice actor whose name is escaping me right now. I'll have to look it up, had voiced the kind of original voiceover voice for TikTok, and it was pretty much the one that everybody was using as a default. She was not hired by TikTok or even a close subsidiary and did not know what her voice was going to be used for. And when she realized what it was used for, she wasn't too happy with that and the ways that it could be manipulated and the ways that it could be, for instance, doing and saying things that could reflect poorly on her professionally. Sort of a similar thing happened with the woman who was the original US female voice for Siri. She had no idea that that was how her voice was going to be used. And for me, as somebody who studies labor, um, that's that's kind of a problem when people's work is sort of abstracted and disembodied and taken away from them. They're quite literally alienated from their labor. And the gender angle adds to it because we see these sorts of things happening in certain ways to men and certain ways to women historically.
I just looked it up. There's a woman named, oh, and by the way, hello, Mar. It's so nice to have you on the show. And I'm honored actually to be here chatting with you today. I've been a big fan from afar for a long time. So it's great to finally meet you in person. There are a couple of women who have sued TikTok, apparently. One was named Beverly Standing, and I think she's the one you might be referring to. And another woman from Canada also did, after discovering that it was using her voice to narrate videos without her permission. I also feel for all the women named Alexa who who, number one, you can't utter their name in various contexts because it activates a device. Number two, it must have a connotation now that it didn't have before. I think that's what you were alluding to, that you might be seen in a different light.
Yeah, I mean, it's a real bummer for anybody whose name is one of these voice assistants names, Siri, Alexa. I know a Siri, and it's a lovely name, but are many people going to continue to use that name on people? Probably not. And you did get the person I was thinking of right on the nose, Bev
Yeah.
Standing. And just recently, I'm sure you saw in the news, to kind of continue this train of thought, Scarlett Johansson had been contacted by Sam Altman's company and had declined to provide the voice for one of their new products. And then the product comes out, and not only does it sound kind of like her from the movie that she had voiced an AI assistant for many years ago, but they actually were making direct comparisons to that movie and her voice from the movie. while simultaneously denying that it had anything to do with her. And because SAG-AFTRA, a big labor union, basically stood behind her as she came out and said, look, this is not okay, this is not right. I believe at last I heard, they had actually backed down from using the voice, and I think they were taking it out of the product. But imagine, how much power that takes, not just her being an incredibly highly paid and powerful Hollywood actor, which is unusual, but also having a really powerful union standing behind her, which in the United States in many industries is not possible. It takes an awful lot for women to stand up and simply say, no, you can't use my labor in that way. You can't extract value from me in that way. I'm not going to allow it, at least not for the rate that you're paying. And that is something that, you just see again and again in the history of technology, because what happens when automated systems come in is that very often the idea is to not displace workers entirely, but displace workers who are either high paid or unionized. And one of the tricks has always been, let's bring in women and or children to do that work. And now one of the tricks is, let's bring in automated women to do that work.
Right. Oh, you raised something that I hadn't even thought about before. One point I wanted to make before I get to that is it would be so easy for technology companies to not have a default voice on these AI assistants. It could be part of the setup process when you get your device or your phone, whatever it may be, where you obviously have to put in a few details about yourself, and you could select a voice at that time. It wouldn't have to be any particular one default voice. But to your point about using women and children, I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised at all if there are devices out there aimed at children that use a children's voice, or that there may be. I don't think that probably Siri or Alexa has a child voice option. As if I were in-house with one of those companies, I would probably advise against it. But without, a certain level of severe restrictions and controls on the use of that voice, because it just smacks me as fraught with issues, whether, you have a child's voice saying things that would be inappropriate for a child to say, or worse. So I just wonder, from this point forward, first of all, do you think we'll get to a point where this issue has been talked about enough that people are able to select their own personal assistant persona when they get a device? And what do you think may happen with this issue of child voices?
Well, two things. The first part, yeah, that's a really interesting question. How would it work if there were not a default voice? And it strikes me that in some ways that would be very difficult to do, because the business model of many of, let's say, the makers of these convenience tools, these automated tools that are largely for people's convenience, the whole idea is to kind of push you to use them, right? There has to be a default. It almost has to be turned on and kind of shoved in your face by default, or the risk is it might not catch on, right? And a lot of these things are essentially tools that are in beta that have been released on the public for further testing and to basically get tuned and improve so that they can, maybe if the first version is not so great, they'll release a better second version, a better third version, or maybe the first version is okay. But nonetheless, they'll make sure that the next version that comes out is perhaps indispensable to consumers because of the way that it's been able to collect all of our, let's say, voice data or our search history data or whatever, and to do two things: to make it more generally robust for anybody using it, but also through spying on us and using our information in ways that most people don't fully understand, it becomes ever more personalized and ever more sort of enmeshed. with whatever it is we're doing, whether it's trying to get to, a doctor's appointment on time, or figuring out how long our commute's going to take in traffic that day. So that's a really, really interesting question. And I think the idea of, when will we have kind of gotten past this issue, is it's going to just be an ongoing issue, right? So we might kind of solve parts of it here and there, but it's one of those things, like any cultural issue, that you can solve it, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't continue to maybe crop up again in other spaces and be a problem. So we kind of just, what's that statement? Price of liberty is eternal vigilance, kind of like that, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And the other aspect about children's voices, that is really fraught. And it really reminds me of some articles that I've read recently, that have been talking about the way that momfluencers and online influencers who are parents have been monetizing their children and their children's private lives, essentially their home lives, on YouTube, TikTok, etc. And how, as the children are growing up and getting old enough to say, I refuse to be on camera, I don't want to do this, there's been a huge labor struggle within these families who, in many cases, have actually, they've monetized YouTube channels to be really, really profitable, like supporting the whole family on coerced labor, because the kid, has grown up not really having any say in whether they're going to be on camera constantly, or in the ways that the parent decides they need to be on camera in order to be, gaining eyeballs, which sometimes means that, for instance, the child is, tricked or subjected to kind of weird or traumatic situations, because a lot of times outrage is what drives views and clicks. And so we're seeing sort of a repeat of what happened with child actors in the 20th century, where they were workers and they were making a lot of money, but oftentimes didn't have control over their money or the conditions of their labor. And a whole new set of labor protections had to actually come in, not just for children in general in the 20th century and children working in factories and stuff like that, which sadly we're seeing some Republicans trying to roll back those protections now, which is wild. But child actors had to have a whole nother set of protections to ensure that, for instance, they got to actually go to school, and that if they couldn't go to school, they would have a tutor who was on set for a certain number of hours, so they could actually be, educated in the ways that children are entitled to. And it feels like something really similar might be happening now with the groundswell of child influencers who have gone into that position, maybe semi-willingly or unwillingly.
So, Mar, you've raised so much there. I'm just going to jump in with a question or two before going back to Denise. And again, you're listening to R&D with D&D on the Hearsay Culture Network. On the last point that you made, with regards to children and technology, of course, we've also seen, I mean, there's so many examples of this, but of course, we know that companies are regularly trying to enforce contracts, right, with children. There was a case recently involving Roblox, and the question of whether children could even assent to contracts. And without getting into the weeds of the law, courts seem to be increasingly willing to more or less say, yeah, maybe a kid could enter into an agreement with a large corporation because the large corporation, i.e. Roblox, says, have some fun with our app, which raises a more fundamental question on I asked before that I come back to something you said earlier about ChatGPT, which is, society seems increasingly comfortable, for lack of a better word, with all of these kinds of what others would think, and maybe at least in recent history would have thought, were really reprehensible treatments of children. And the chicken and egg question kind of is begged here. Do you think that technology and the ways in which technology have kind of, and I'm talking about the internet, right, has particularly conditioned people to just kind of say, this is how it is, or this is how it's going to be, has kind of created, a lemming mindset in a lot of these areas? Because the child influences issue is one that at least for policymakers, they're aware of it. and it just kind of goes forward, just like Roblox kind of enters into contracts. I put that in quotes as a contracts professor with children. Where is this conditioning coming from, or why do you think society is increasingly comfortable with it?
So interesting, because in some ways I can see what you're saying, but I see an awful lot in my day to day. I actually see an awful lot of discomfort with people who are adults or children kind of pushing back against a lot of these technologies, or using the technologies, but using them in ways that are intentionally trying to push the boundaries of what they are supposed to be doing with them. For instance, if you're on TikTok, basically the younger generations have created a whole different TikTok specific language and set of words, of vocabulary, so as not to get flagged by TikTok's content moderation algorithms. So for instance, you can never say die or kill or murder. It's always unalive. Now, does that still work since it's so well known? Who knows, but it's constantly evolving like language always does, right? So these younger folks are trying very, very intentionally to push back while still getting value and use out of, for instance, that app. And to your question about sort of like, how is this happening, or what is technology's role in it? As a historian who studies technology, but also labor and institutions, one thing that always comes to my mind, and I just really want to foreground, even if it's obvious, is that when we are using technologies that are built by major corporations, it's not a fair fight. These are huge, as you pointed out, Dave, these are huge and powerful and profitable institutions that in many cases have government in their pocket. And even though the people who govern us are democratically elected, or should be, that's the idea at least, they don't necessarily respond to what the great mass of people want. They respond to what lobbyists are telling them. This is going to be good for you in your upcoming election cycle. So I think that there's a lot going on with what you might call structural harms, and ways that technologies are sort of pushing and pulling us, that we're, I think, collectively getting more and more uncomfortable with. And we see the value in many of these tools, but I think at the same time, we have an uneasy relationship with the fact that in order to be valuable to us, these tools have to be constantly on, constantly listening, or we don't know to what extent they're listening and collecting information. I feel like there is a lot of uneasiness, and maybe that's changed in the past, I don't know, couple of years. I feel like that's growing now.
It's interesting, and we're going to come to Denise is going to talk to you shortly about some of the work you're doing more recently in conferences coming up. But I have to follow up this way. I at least from what I have experienced teach, and I know, and we're both professors, teaching people in their early 20s, and then I have sons in their teens. There, I find, even among people that tend to have we're going to make things better, almost kind of a begrudging acceptance that, look, there's certain forces that are too big, and we're not going to be able to fight, which is, of course, is not generally what we think of children as being able to say, you're going to change the world, which is my follow-up question, which is, of course, going back to Sam Altman and OpenAI. You alluded to it a little while ago, and I want to come back to it, which is, the fact that this is being driven by private entities. I have my background's in industrial labor relations, and so I share that perspective on it. And so when you look at the gold rush around generative AI, really eclipsing all other values, it seems, that we might want to consider with regard to generative AI, from societal benefit to protecting, right, the disenfranchised, protecting people with less economic power. It really is hard to envision that we're not going to see exponentially greater challenges as you alluded to at the beginning, right? As OpenAI more or less says, at least initially, we're going to do this because we can with regard to Scarlett Johansson. And of course, Scarlett Johansson has the resources to fight back that, as you allude to, most people won't. How do we, and I know that we could spend the rest of the show on this, but I'll ask you, take a couple of minutes on it quickly. How do we counter, if we need to, the forces of profit making around this technology that can squeeze out all of the values that Denise has asked about, that I've asked about, and that you're raising?
I'm so glad you asked. And as somebody with your background, I'm sure you can probably imagine where I'm going to
Yeah,
go.
that's fine. Yeah. That's good.
Um,
We might go in the same direction. We'll find out.
I 100% agree that a lot of folks of all ages feel like we're kind of being crushed under a boot heel in certain ways. I also, have been paying attention to all of the ways that younger folks who have an awful lot to lose have been really, really pushing back against stuff. Well, for a long time, but recently it's sort of reached a flashpoint, and they're complaining and pushing back about a lot of interconnected issues, right? And one of the ways that they're building power is in these sort of um, collective movements that we have seen again and again throughout history. If we look at the ways that technology in the past has done harmful things to society, harmful things to workers and consumers, two things come to mind as, really important driving forces in undoing those harms and helping us get to a point where there are safer technologies and there's regulation. The first is, of course, labor unions. They're old-fashioned. They're still very relevant. And the second is legal challenges. And we've been seeing a lot of those as well. There's a legal challenge right now. I think it's Anderson et al. Versus Midjourney, where a bunch of artists who had posted their work online had their artwork scraped and used to train different styles that Midjourney could create or auto-generate images in different artist styles. And that lawsuit's been really interesting. It's really making headway. So I think pairing up, the might of workers, student protests, lawyers who are operating for the public good or in the public interest, or consumer protection lawyers. I try hard not to think that everything is just going to be bleak and steamroll over us, not because I'm such an optimistic individual, I'm really not, but as a historian, I've seen this pattern before, right? And it always looks very grim and like Goliath cannot fall, and then they do. So fingers crossed.
Wow, that's a very heartening thing to hear because living in the present, it is hard to see how we get to that point. But one of the ways that we may get to that point, before I ask you about your conference, which Dave alluded to, just to follow up on what you were saying about ways in which certain areas are regulated and others are not. When you think about just the difference between if you do genetic testing with a doctor, how confidential that is, how careful they are with your data about getting permissions for your data and who you can talk to about that data because of HIPAA. And yet there are big private entities like 23andMe and Ancestry out there that can and do and in great volume collect the same information from people with no such safeguards. And that is quite a scary prospect for me. Also a scary prospect for anybody who has been paying attention to the debate over AI is whether and how it's going to destroy us, right? And the problem that seems to come up as a thought experiment a lot is this paperclip problem, where if you tell a sufficiently super intelligent entity that its goal is to make paperclips, it will do so perhaps to the exclusion of all else and to the use of all resources on Earth, including all of humanity and anything else that might usefully be deployed to make paper clips, and then on out into the universe until all such resources have been destroyed. And so what I love about this conference that you have coming up in July 18th at University of Virginia, it's an online conference. So I assume that folks can join in from wherever if they're interested. Right now, you have a call for papers out on rethinking the inevitability of AI, the environmental and social impacts of computing in historical context. And the reason I bring up the paperclip problem is because your conference sort of underscores that we made paperclip problem ourselves before we ever get around to letting AI do the dirty deed for us, because these tools involve so much energy to perform their tasks. Can you tell us more about the conference and what you're looking to delve into there?
Sure, yeah. The conference is called Rethinking the Inevitability of AI, and it's about kind of historicizing how we got to this moment where it seems like AI is everything and going to be everywhere, but specifically looking at the environmental history of data centers and computing and what happens as we start to see compute, as they call it, as almost a limitless resource when it's not at all. It's being subsidized very heavily by, for instance, taxpayers through how we pay for water utilities, how we pay into preserving electrical grids and things like that. And when you have a technology that is trying very hard to make itself indispensable and grow very quickly, what you often see is a situation where it's sort of like robbing Peter to pay Paul, or there's a bit of arbitrage going on, right? Where they have to say, well, look, we're just going to kind of forget about the fact that it overuses this resource over here, and we're only going to focus on what it might do over here, or what it could possibly potentially do over here in the future. And that's really problematic with technologies like AI, which, as you both know, we've heard about how they are going to revolutionize society and do all these amazing sci-fi things for about a century now, right? It's always 10 to 20 years off. And I think that that rhetoric can be really dangerous, because what it does is it encourages people to not take seriously the problems of growth that are right in front of them. I'm not saying that I'm against AI developing or that I think it's not going to be useful in certain specific ways, but I do think that when you have something that is essentially a poorer version of a search engine that might give, and often does give, wildly inaccurate information that can not really be checked easily at all, and you're saying that that product is sort of entitled to overconsume resources for some reason, I think that's a conversation that we really should put in a historical framework and talk about how, robber barons of past centuries, the oil industry, how many other industries have said things like this. And what has happened ultimately is that people have not been able to solve the problems because the problems have become entrenched. And now we're trying really hard to kind of go back and dig at the foundations of that infrastructure. And for instance, change to a different energy source, for instance, so that we can start to undo some of these really intractable problems that at the time, the idea was, oh, look at all of this explosive growth, this explosive economic growth. Don't worry about the fact we're polluting the rivers. Don't worry about the fact that you can't breathe the air without, in some cases, dropping dead. So yeah, it's history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, right?
Yeah, that's a great phrase. So for all of those naysayers who would come back and say, the only way to solve these problems is to go all in on these AI tools. And we're going to have to deplete resources in order to ultimately have unlimited resources. Do you think that's just a pipe dream?
I think that when all you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And I also think there are a lot of very, very smart people right now in those industries who are concerned with these issues and are trying to get us to develop these tools in more responsible ways. But they're not getting listened to, and they're not getting venture capital thrown at them. Because if you go about things more slowly and carefully and intelligently, there's going to be less immediate return for investors, right? So we have this really negative mechanism in our system and the way that the market operates to incentivize people who want to move fast and break things and who won't necessarily even get us to the outcomes or the solutions that they're promising. They'll just kind of get us part of the way towards, they'll get us to a position where a bunch of people who are far wealthier than any of us listening to this, I'm sure, can make another million or another few million or another billion. And so I am very leery of the folks who get up there and get all the news coverage and say, this is the only way to solve problem X, because there are so many smart, dedicated computer scientists, AI researchers, machine learning researchers who are saying, no, this is not the way we should be going about this. And look at my actual research on how we can do this better in an environmental sense, or in a way that these technologies are less socially biased, or in a way where the the privacy rights that are enshrined in HIPAA or FERPA are not just violated willy-nilly, or in a way that consumers can be sure that they're not actually going to be harmed by these tools. So that's my sort of, I guess, not quite true believer response to the whole AI boom.
Yeah.
And there's this argument of inevitability, excuse me, Mar, which also comes through all of it that I want to ask you about and tie it into some of the ethical AI issues that you've discussed before, and that'll be our last question before we do our rapid fire. So let me sum it up this way. Both of us being labor historians and students of labor of sorts. Your parallel to earlier labor challenges, I think, is fascinating. And we can go back, of course, even further, right, and you alluded to it a bit, to the robber barons, right? And its concept, at least the positive concept of the robber barons, that while they were making money hand over fist, they felt some kind of ethical or moral responsibility back to society to at least create some institutions. And I recognize that's one way to view it, but I'm going to give the positive view of it. Build institutions that would benefit society as a whole, right? So there's examples that we have Carnegie Mellon University, for example, and so forth. And that ethic also, we see manifest today, at least with regard to charitable donations. And you can think about the Gates Foundation, although that's also controversial in a lot of areas. But it ties in this broader question of ethics. You commented a couple of years ago now to Motherboard when they posted an article entitled "Ethical AI Trained on Reddit" posts, said genocide is okay if it makes people happy. And we've seen that repeat itself. We saw Microsoft's Tay earlier than that, and of course we have it now. And what you see these companies doing, this is the tie-in, we see companies doing today, and it's kind of now a running joke, particularly with ChatGPT. If you ask it any question that seems to have any overtone that could be divisive, ChatGPT will decline to respond. Now you can hack it through different queries, but we see that at least OpenAI has taken that seriously. And of course, one of the concerns about putting this technology out there is that there are other, any number of uses that will not even consider ethics. And so I want to use an extreme example of it and get your reaction to it. The question being, how prolific at this point, given that it's out there, how much can we do to rein in or at least change AI? But there have been very recent articles written in Bloomberg and other places showing that ISIS, for example, is using open AI, or at least using some AI technology to literally create news anchors that are both video and audio of ISIS reports using the same technology that we're discussing here. So here's my big question for you with that lead in. Right, you think about 100+ years of labor history where this push and pull between worker rights and company rights, and you have a technology that itself is difficult or impossible to rein in, and here we are talking about ethics. And my question is, has the horse left the barn? To put it differently, how do ethics matter in a world where the technology is so already enmeshed in so many places that the conversation about ethics almost seems quaint?
I guess to me, ethics still matter, because to me, I don't think we have a choice. Like we can't get out of this situation, right? Like Elon Musk has some fantasies that we can go to Mars and make a fresh start, but I'm not too sanguine about that. I think that we have these problems and we have to solve them, or we cannot solve them, and then things will continue to get worse until once again people think we need to we need to try again to solve them. And it's very it's a struggle, right? The process of historical change it's a struggle. And if we see things as kind of there's an endpoint or there's a solution, that can lead us to some very, I think, dangerous thinking, because it's a process that we have to constantly be engaged in. And sometimes that process is going to be quite horrible, as you know from the history of the labor movement. Andrew Carnegie was among many rich men in the United States and elsewhere who sent out, hired thugs to essentially bash people's heads in order to get his way. And he also famously said of all of his charitable giving that he liked it because it provided a, quote, refuge for self-questioning. So
yeah, the Pinkerton agent, comes to mind immediately, right?
Right. So I see what you're saying. I think that things do change, that things are different. The scale and the speed of a lot of the things that are happening now, it does seem almost like, oh, this is going to be inevitable, or we're not going to be able to get out in front of this. But in fact, history shows us that we're very rarely ever out in front of anything. Regulation always lags dangerous technologies by quite a lot, by a distressingly high number of years, and deadly incidents and poisonings of communities. Like, regulation lags, but it doesn't mean that when we finally get it, it's not still useful. We have fewer poison spaces and fewer poison waterways and more clean water and more clean air, because we did in previous generations have people who were struggling to combat issues that are in many ways similar to the issues we're facing with AI, because AI seems very fancy and ephemeral and disembodied, but it's run off the same power sources as everything else. And it's going to affect the same people in the same meat bodies and the same physical environment as all these other technologies. So again, I'm not by nature an optimist, but I guess I'm also not too pessimistic. I'm not pessimistic enough that I would say that I think, the horse is gone, that's it. We have no more horses, or we're going to have to get a new horse. I think, you have to go and get the horse, and you're going to eventually, at some point, get to a point where these problems are so difficult to work and live around that we simply will have to address them. I feel like we're at that point in some ways right now. So the struggle continues, I guess.
All right. Well, we have so enjoyed having this conversation with you today, Mar. And to close out, we like to throw you some, softball questions. Some of them could probably take some lengthy answers, but we'll ask you to try and just give your shoot from the hip response. And I'll go first. Who's your favorite artist in any medium?
Oh, wow. Let me think about that. Well, the first thing that comes to mind actually is there's a filmmaker named Michael Haneke that I really like. And I think it comes to mind because his movies are interesting, but they're also very moralistic and heavy-handed. And I feel like they sort of apply in interesting ways to some of the things we've been talking about.
Cool. I will investigate. Do you own any cryptocurrency?
I do not.
There has been debate in our country about whether the Constitution, whether it's a state constitution or the overall US Constitution, permits states to regulate or bodies to regulate minority inclusion on boards of directors. Do you think that there's a constitutional barrier to that or no?
Well, I don't have a law background, so I probably can't give a good answer to that.
Okay, thanks. I think it's an open question. And my final question for you is, what is the best pet?
I'm very partial to rabbits.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Dave.
We have two dogs, and I'm always concerned when I see rabbits in the yard because I feel like they're not patrolling strongly enough. So here are mine, Mar. We didn't spend a lot of time on the. We talked a little bit about history, but I want to dive in quickly. The most underrated scientist in history.
Oh, the most underrated scientist in history is somebody whose name we don't even know.
Yeah, fair enough. That means a lot of people too, I guess. How about the most overrated scientist in history?
Hmm. Well, that's a minefield, right?
Yeah,
But I think that if you're let's say a 20th century physicist who has a lot of books written about him, you're probably pretty overrated.
yeah. I could give a couple of guesses there. Generative AI, more likely, this is a crystal ball question, more likely to be a net positive or a net negative?
Well, I gotta give a little bit of a half answer on that one because it depends on whom you are, right? If you're already somebody for whom society generally works well and you're on top, it's probably going to be a net positive. If you're somebody for whom the systems in place don't work well, it could very likely be a net negative because you're the sort of person on whom those technologies are going to be turned and tested and used in negative ways rather than somebody who just has the privilege to use them for convenience when they want.
We have our work cut out for us. The last question to think about these things: best vacation location for thought.
Oh, I don't know. I guess just anywhere that you can be with people that you want to be with.
Thank you. The rapid fire, thoughtful answers too, which is the point.
Yes, thank you so much, Mar. It's been a great pleasure to have you with us here today on the Hearsay Culture Network. We put out this show a couple of times a month. We put out Dave's show, Hearsay Culture, weekly. And my own show, Uneven Distribution, also a couple of times a month. So if you like what you've been listening to here today, please come and join us back on Hearsay Culture on a regular basis. Feel free to subscribe to our network to be able to have access to things like the video versions of our shows and other wonderful benefits, such as the ability to sit down with Dave and I and unpack the shows after the fact. We'd really love to hear more from you in all ways possible. I'm Denise at Hearsay Culture. Dave is Dave at hearsayculture.com. Please reach out to us. Let us know what you're thinking of the network and the shows. And we hope to have you back often and happily. And until the next episode, take care.